Okay, here we are, part two. And I'm going to be talking a little bit now about the role of emotions in all this. But let's go to this question about this mystery that I talked about earlier, about how everybody with ADHD seems to have at least one or often a few areas in which they can have very good executive function, even though they have a lot of difficulty with executive function in almost everything else. And this is the situational variability of the symptoms. And I was using the example of the hockey player and a couple of others that followed it earlier, and how puzzling it is when people are looking at that and saying, how can you be so good at being able to focus for this and not for that and that and that? And usually, if you ask people who have this kind of difficulty, the question of why can you do it here and not there, the answer that you often get is, it's easy. If it's something I'm really interested in, I can do all right. And most people who hear that will say, yeah, right, congratulations. That's true for anybody. Anybody's going to pay attention better for something they're interested in than for something they're not, which is true. But here's the difference. People who don't have ADD, if they've got something they've got to do and they know they've got to do it and it's important, they can usually make themselves pay attention, even if it's pretty boring, just because they know they got to do it. People with ADD, it is incredibly difficult for them to be able to make themselves pay attention unless the task is something that is really interesting to them, not because somebody told them it ought to be interesting, but just because it is for whatever reason. Or if they feel like they have a gun to their head and something very unpleasant is going to be happening very quickly if they don't take care of this right here, right now. Under those two conditions, no difference. And it looks like such a mystery, but the fact is, if you have something which really, really interests you, not because somebody told you it ought to be interesting because it'll help improve your grade average or it's going to be important in graduation or something else, but just because it is interesting for whatever reason. Or you have a gun to your head where you feel something very unpleasant is going to be happening very fast if you don't take care of this right here, right now. Under those two conditions, it changes the chemistry of the brain instantly. The problem is it is not under voluntary control. And that's where we run into the difficulties. And so we have two hypotheses about this. One is the willpower, and the other is erectile dysfunction. You know, I had this patient who came in one day and he said, I've got a sexual example for you for what it's like to have ADD. He said, having ADD is like having erectile dysfunction of the mind. If the task is something that turns you on, you're up for it and you can perform. But if the task you're trying to do is not something that's intrinsically interesting, if it doesn't turn you on, you can't get it up. And if you can't get it up, you're not going to be able to perform. And in that situation, it does not matter how much you may say to yourself, I need to, I really ought to, I should. You can't make it happen because it is simply not a willpower kind of thing. I think that is the most difficult thing for most people to understand about this disorder. It looks for all the world as though it is a problem of willpower, when in fact it's not. So, if that's the case, that it's not just a willpower thing, that there's some magical thing that we can garner up when we need it, if we're willing. We have the question then of how is it that the brain goes about the business of determining what to ignore or what to blow off, what to do or not to do now. Well, the first thing to say about this is motivation is not a unified variable. We use that word a lot, but it's not as though it's all just so much gas in the tank and you have more or less of it. Motivation is idiosyncratic. It's different for each individual person, and it is different from one task or situation to another. And the fact is that our brain is amazingly complex in the way it deals with these things. Because each perception, each thought we have, each task we encounter is instantly screened by the brain's mechanism, which operates like a Google search, that pulls up relevant unconscious memories throughout the cortex that then compete to activate either our tendency to approach it or to avoid it or to just blow it off. Luis Passoa at the University of Maryland wrote one time, this is one of the newer books which is pretty good at being able to talk about a problem we've had in our theory building. And that is that for a long time they've been talking as though emotion is in one silo and cognition is in the other, and they're two completely separate things. And what now is clear from the brain science that we have available to us is these two are inextricably connected. And as a matter of fact, it is emotion that provides the basis on which the brain determines which things are going to be responded to and which things are not. The trick is it's unconscious emotion. Ken Dodge, another neuroscientist, wrote way back in 1991, he said, you know, all information processing, he's talking about the brain, is emotional. Emotion is the energy level that drives and organizes and amplifies and attenuates our cognitive activity. Now let's talk a little bit about what that means. This is a pretty complex little drawing. It is not a diagram of the brain, it's a schematic. So this is not showing you what part of the brain is where, but instead, what it's looking at is the result of a very complex study of what parts of the brain are connected to what other parts of the brain. And this blue circle that you see, that's the abbreviation for the amygdala. The amygdala is a segment of brain which is about the size of 2 almonds put together, deep in the brain. And it is connected to all these little abbreviations you see are all different parts of the brain. And at the time that this was originally published in 1994, they had identified 72 different connection points between the amygdala for output, where it's putting out messages to other parts of the brain. And now, since that time, more recent studies shows that there are over 1,000 points of connection. So that we get messages from other parts of the brain, because of course memory is not all stored in one filing cabinet in the brain. It's stored in many different parts of the brain and then gets reassembled. But the amygdala works unconsciously, quicker than we are even aware of what's happening. You know, you get a feeling about something. Man, that's interesting. Or, ugh, I don't want to deal with that. Or, oh my God. And sometimes you're not even clear about quite what it is that's setting it off for you, but you just have a feeling that you want to act on it, or not. Well, the thing to know about the amygdala is that it is strongly context dependent. It depends on where you are and what you're doing and who you're with for its responses. That's what pulls up the things that are going to be responded to. And the amygdala very flexibly integrates stimulus valence, which is just fancy talk for saying, based on my previous experiences, does this look like something I really want to be into? Is it something that's cueing me saying, yeah, let's find out some more about this? Or, do we really have to bother with this? But the point is, I've underlined the word current with our current goals, meaning not what we've planned for this quarter of the calendar year, but what in this moment we're trying to do in this conversation with this person, or in this time when we're trying to read this book or this magazine article or listen to this TV thing. And what our motivations are, what's up for us in terms of what we're wanting to accomplish, and what the demands of the context are. Let's look at that for a minute. Where we are and who we're with shapes our emotions. Let me tell you a story. My wife and I were on a transatlantic flight, and we were lucky enough to be flying business class instead of the cheap seats in back. And it happened that the particular airline that we were on bakes chocolate chip cookies when you're in mid-flight. And they smell great. And if you happen to be lucky enough that you're sitting in first class or business class, then you get a cookie offered to you. The poor people sitting in the back of the bus, which is where we usually end up, they can smell them, but they don't get them. Well, here's the situation. We're mid-flight at this point, and I smell the cookies baking. I had been on a diet for several weeks trying to lose a little bit of excess pounds. You can see that it was not terribly successful. But the fact is that I'd lost some pounds at that point, and my wife was functioning as the food police. She was pretty subtle about it, but, it's like, do you really need that? Or, boy, you've been doing well on your diet, haven't you? And so I'm thinking, well, damn, here these cookies are coming up. But then on the other hand, I was thinking I have been losing weight, and I'm doing pretty well with that, and I can feel pretty good about what I've been accomplishing so far. And so the flight attendant's coming up the aisle with this tray of cookies and handing them out to people, and I happen to glance over, and my wife was asleep. So I'm thinking to myself, boy, those cookies smell good. And, well, really, would one cookie really make that much difference? And then I looked again just to be sure she was really asleep. And it seemed like she was. And meanwhile, the flight attendant appears with a tray. And she asked the question, would you like a cookie? I hesitated for just a moment. And I said, yes, I really would, thank you. And by the way, could you give me another one for my wife as well, please, because she's asleep. I think you probably know where this story is going. I ate both cookies very quickly, hauled my butt back to the galley with the 2 plates that had the evidence of crumbs on them, and didn't bother her with that information until after the flight was completed. But my point about this is simply to say, I really do believe that if she had been awake, I would have felt good about saying no thank you. Because what I was thinking of as her line on it was very much also a part of what I felt. I didn't feel like I looked as good as I wanted to or felt as good as I wanted to. I really did want to lose weight. I'd lost a little bit, and I knew I didn't really need that cookie, even though it smelled good. And had she been there, awake, I would have said with some pride and thinking, well, look at me. I'm doing the right thing. But, since she was, in fact, asleep, the other side of my ambivalence about this emerged, and that's what I acted on. Same thing happens to all of us in a variety of different situations. It's not as though our motives are constant. They shift according to where we are and what we're doing. Think about a student who works very hard to get every single term paper in on time, and that student suddenly may not give a damn whether or not the paper's in because he just found out his girlfriend broke up with him and now is dating somebody else, and that's all he can think about. Or suppose, on the other hand, you've got a student who really could care less about getting his papers in on time, is just kind of lukewarm about that, and yet he's playing on the basketball team, and he just got word that if he doesn't get his grade in that one course up by the next marking period, he's going to lose his eligibility. And at that point, this student who could care less about the papers may suddenly have very strong interest and work very hard to complete the paper so he can maintain his eligibility to stay on the team. Things like that happen every day. It depends on where you are and what the circumstances are. Which feelings are going to be in ascendancy? Which ones are going to be acting? And sometimes we're paralyzed when we were pulled in 2 or 3 different directions at once. But the thing that's impressive about it when you study the neuroscience is that this rapid-fire calculus of the amygdala and the related networks sort these competing priorities out for us faster than anything can happen on our computer. You think it's remarkable when you hit Google and tell it, I want to get information about blah, blah, blah? And in 7 seconds, you've got a whole list of blah, blah, blah citations that you can check out. Brain's faster than that. It remembers what you've seen. It can remember what you've heard. It can remember where you encountered something that's sort of like this before and what it got you. You can remember things without, and I'm talking about remembering now as though you were conscious of it, but the fact is most of this operates at an unconscious level, and it even remembers what you saw happening to other people who did or didn't do whatever it is you're thinking about. And then the output from the amygdala, which doesn't take a long time to make up our mind usually, zips out to other parts of the brain and quickly alters the functional connectivity that activates or doesn't both the bodily reactions and the brain. It's amazing stuff. So let's talk a little bit about what's up with people with ADHD. Why do they have more trouble with motivation? Well, the fact is, people who have ADHD have the same kind of emotions that everybody else has, in approximately the same age range. Yet, they often have more difficulty in recognizing their emotions, in responding to them, and then in managing them, and that tends to cause a lot of difficulty with motivation for many. I'm going to tell you stories about just a few people. These are some cases that I've written about in that book, Smart But Stuck, Emotions in Teens and Adults with ADHD, which incidentally, every one of the cases, the front part of the book, the first chapter, which is sort of boring for many people, is about theoretical stuff, about how I'm trying to say, hey, we need to change our understanding of what ADD is about, and include this more. Then I've got 11 case studies in there, and these are all people who have IQs 120 or above. Every single one of them has an ADHD diagnosis and in the top 9% of the population. So we're not talking about geniuses here. This is not Einstein, but they are people who are damn smart. Some of them are teenagers, some are adults, and they're all people that I work with pretty closely for long enough to be able to describe the process. And I use those stories to talk about some of these things that I've been learning. And so let's talk about Sue, 14-year-old girl in high school, and she's in with her mother. And her mother is very worried about her and really pretty annoyed with her. And the kid is sitting there, and she's saying to me, until I got into middle school, I always got good grades, and I never got into trouble. Before I go any further, let me tell you what she looked like. She's dressed with black slacks, black blouse, black leather jacket, black makeup, and looks, totally goth image. And she said, now everybody thinks I'm hopeless because I dress goth and I just don't do much homework. My parents and teachers, they look down on me just because of the friends I hang out with. They don't really know me or my friends. And her mother is sitting there like this. And her mother says, we're really worried about her. We don't know what's going to happen. She used to do so well, and now it looks like it's all going down the toilet, and she's in high school now. And here's her report card. And I said to Sue, what am I going to see when I look at this report card? And she says, you're going to see that there's some C's there, a couple of D's. It's not nearly as good as it used to be. But I don't think things are so bad as they think. It doesn't matter anyhow. And the mother is saying, well, what about the fact we've got complaints from the teachers and your smart-ass attitude in class, talking back to the teachers? That doesn't go over very well with me or with your father. And the conversation went on. And pretty soon I said, well, to Sue, got any idea why things have changed so much? And she said, well, it's a lot different in high school. I said, well, that's true, but not everybody finds themselves in this spot with their parents that you seem to be in. Not everybody's grades go down when they go into high school. And she says, I don't know. My father, he's always on my case, and he used to like me a lot, but he doesn't like me that much anymore. And I said, well, how long has it been that way? And she said, well, I guess a couple of years. It's getting worse now. I said, what's getting worse? And she said, he's getting more crabby now. I said, why? And she says, well, it's I think he's just mad at me. I don't think he likes me as much as he used to. And then she says, I guess it's ever since he's been getting sicker. I said, what do you mean he's getting sicker? And the mother looked at her, said, don't try to use that as an excuse. I said, no, tell me, please. How's he sicker? It turned out her father had Parkinsons. And they hadn't brought it up. I'd already been through all the questions, what's going on in the family and so forth. And that had not been mentioned, in spite of my asking about who's in the family and what can you tell me about him. And so we scheduled another meeting with the father there too. And I could see when the father walked in, his gait was unsteady. This was, somewhat advanced Parkinson's. And we talked about it, and he was pretty good. He said, yes, it has been getting worse. And then she said to him, I don't think you like me as much. And the father was really pretty good with her. And he said, I don't like some of the stuff you've been pulling. I don't like it when you get snotty with your mother. I don't like it when you get snotty with the teachers. And I don't like it when you blow off your homework. I want to see you do better. But I got to tell you the truth. It's also true that this disease is making me more irritable than I used to be. This was an issue which had not been discussed in the family. And it turned out that her getting into the goth outfits was something that was happening right about the same time her father was backing off. But then he looked at her and he said, but I'll tell you something. I want you to know that I am not in a position right now where I'm happy with some of the things you're doing, but I love you. And I want to see you do better for your sake and not just for mine. And the kid wiped a couple of tears away and says, yeah. And we went on with the meeting. A couple of days later, I heard from the mother that the father and daughter had started working together on the kid's homework. And that she was lightening up and a little more active. And in fact, subsequent meetings, she was talking about how she didn't think she was all that smart, that she was now in high school, and it seems like she wasn't getting the homework as well, didn't understand things as easily as she used to. And I said, okay, well, let's do an IQ test. Let's see how you do. And so we did one. She came out in the superior range. That was a surprise to her and also to her parents. And the father was very proud of her, and the mother said, well, look, you see, you have the ability now. You just need to do it. You see, this often happens in families where you have a kid with ADHD. There often is a splitting of roles. I call it the perpetual battle between the kick-ass and the marshmallow. You have one parent who says, this kid has to learn how to behave. He is not going to be able to live in the world the way he's operating. We need to enforce the rules. We need to give him consequences for things so that he's going to learn how to deal with the world as it really is. And then you've got the other parent. It could be the father, it could be the mother. They change roles back and forth sometimes. Who's saying, this kid is in trouble every place he goes. Don't you think it's good for him to have at least one place where he feels appreciated and supported and kind? And what happens then is their positions get more and more extreme, and the kick-ass and the marshmallow battle it out without realizing they're both right. And the task is being able to pull it together so that they can make those difficult decisions about when you tighten up and when you loosen up. Well, it turned out that this kid did, in fact, seem to do quite a bit better as she got recognition of what her abilities were, and also she was able to get some accommodations in school. She was having trouble finishing her papers and did, in fact, need extended time. Not everybody with ADD needs extended time for tests, but she sure did. And one of the follow-up sessions, they came back and showed me that very proudly that she had been she was all back in all A's and B's now, and that she had gotten the Student of the Month award. And the principal had written a note saying, your achievements and contributions are not only personal successes, but serve as exemplary standards toward which all the students in our school can aspire. This is truly impressive progress over just 1 year. And she went on, and somebody else was taking over the treatment for her. It was closer because it was a long trip for her to get to my office. And then about 7 years later, I got a letter from her. And here's the text of the letter. I was a patient of yours almost 7 years ago. At that time, you diagnosed me with ADHD. Before you identified the disorder, it was academically and socially debilitating. Notice the vocabulary. Since that diagnosis, the medication and therapy have completely changed my life. I do not think I can fully articulate how much this has impacted my life and my family's, but I'm incredibly thankful for all that you have done. I am now studying to become a psychologist so I can offer that same care and support to others who desperately need it, like I did. You know, not every story has a happy ending like that, and of course she's starting graduate school. She's not finishing graduate school at this moment. You know, you learn to be cautious about these things. But the fact is that there are times when the diagnosis of ADHD can be helpful to people as an explanation for difficulties they've been struggling with for some time. But of course, the other problem that goes with this is many people have a picture in their head of the ADD kid. And usually it is the kid who was screwing around in class all the time, was always getting yelled at by the teacher, and that nobody liked very much. And it's like you say, well, I think you have ADHD, and they want to say, no, you've made a mistake. This is not a club to which I belong. You know, if you have a picture of ADHD as a bunch of losers, you're not going to want to be able to sign up and say, yeah, that's me. It's very important for people to have a chance to understand what this is really about and to understand that there are some people who do have a lot of behavioral troubles, and they're really a pain in the ass to the people that they have to deal with, their family and their teachers and so forth, and they're annoying to other kids. But there are a lot of other people who really get along quite well in many areas of their lives who just struggle with this as an important difficulty that they have and that they need to work on. But in order for them to be willing to swallow this as a way of thinking about what their situation actually is, it's important for them to understand that they're not joining a club which is a club of losers. You know, it can be if that's the way that they play their cards, but that certainly is not the way it has to be. You know, so, you know, in the situation with this particular kid, the confrontations between her and her mother were particularly painful. Documenting what her strengths were was important. Validating for the accommodations helped her, and then our talking about the frustrations that all of them were having with one another, and the hope and reassurance that was provided, particularly by her dad at that point. He was the one, the mother came along eventually, but he was the one who was able to break through and say, look, I love you, and I want to see you do well. And the parents decided that it was probably better not to micromanage things as much as they had been. There's another kid. He said, you know, he's 20 years old, and he said, I'm in a great university where I want to do well, but I just can't get myself motivated to do the work. I did really well in high school. Now my grades have tanked. I've been spending too much time hanging out with my girlfriend and smoking weed. I've tried some ADHD medicines, but they make me jittery. This was a kid who could not tolerate what would be a clinically effective dose of the medication. And the fact is, he had a lot of structure around him when he was living at home. He had tutors coming in and working with him, and he was getting extra help after school. But the other thing that was going on with him was a very powerful fear of being alone. You know, and he had one girl that he was dating who was making a lot of problems for him, but he was very reluctant to break off that relationship, even though everybody was telling him to. Because he was worried about whether or not he'd do it. And he said, a very appealing kid, had a great sense of humor, he's a good-looking fellow, smart, and really interesting. And he said to me, I was asking, why are you hanging out in this relationship that you and everybody else are telling me is not such a good relationship? And he said, well, if I dump her, I'm not sure I would ever find anybody else who would want me. I thought he was joking. You know, this is a kid that would be considered a nice catch by most of the girls that were around. And I saw what was going on one time when he was in my office, and he got a text from another girl saying, would you like to go to this party with me? And he had gotten it, and he showed it to me when he came in. He'd gotten it about 10 minutes before the appointment. And then he sent a message back to her. He said, I don't know if I should answer. I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, well, try it. So he sends her a text message saying, when's the party? That might be interesting. And he did not get an immediate response. This kid began pacing in my office, back and forth from one side to the other, when it exceeded 7 minutes after the text message had been sent. And he said, see, she doesn't really want to go out with me. I said, well, did you consider the possibility she might be in class? Or she might be taking a shower? Or maybe her phone ran out of juice? Something like that. She did eventually call, text him back, and they did go out. But what was very clear from this was a kid who has a problem which a lot of people with ADHD have, and that is social anxiety. They used to call it social phobia. And it's the kind of thing which doesn't show up. Phobias, the nature of a phobia is you're not one of these generalized anxiety people where you worry about everything. You worry about very specific things. If you have a dog phobia, you're fine unless somebody says, we got to walk by that dog down there. If you have a plane phobia, you're fine until your boss says you got to fly to London in order to take care of this thing for your job, and you're convinced that the minute they close the cabin door, you're in your tomb. And you're going to think about it and think about it. In the case of social anxiety, it's like when you're dealing with people you don't already really know and trust to like you, you'd rather cut off your arm than to have to go to be there at that party or that meeting or to go apply for a job or something like that. And he had a bad case of this. He finally went out with her. They had a good time, and I asked him about it when he came back, and he said, well, yeah, I had to take a couple of drinks before I could go out, but then we had a good time while we were there. At least that's what she told me. But I'm not sure. Maybe she just felt sorry for me. You see how this works? And you're talking with somebody who has an ADD problem. It's not just that this kid had trouble with homework. Now, how was he dealing with it? He was getting baked. He was getting himself stoned. And the question then was, well, are we going to play it with the 12-step rule saying you have to get clean before we can do anything else to help you? We'd already demonstrated the medicines we had for ADHD were not going to work for him because it was freaking him out, which happens occasionally. I chose instead a harm reduction approach to try and get him gradually to cut down on the amount of weed he was smoking, but this gets back into that immediate versus delayed rewards thing. And it turned out that his family realized that, something that he said to me straight out one day. He said, if I get a lousy grade on something, what's that really going to do? Well, yes, at the end of the year, I'm not going to get very good grades and the credits may be down. But how much difference does that make to me now? I really don't give a damn at this particular point today. What I'm concerned about is what's happening today. Many people with ADD say they live perpetually in the now, and that's the way it worked for him. And so the parents actually worked out they had been giving him a credit card for whatever expenses he wanted to have while he was in school. And they weren't even monitoring it very closely. And so what I suggested to them is, he said, if I had a job where if I didn't show up, I wouldn't have any money for that next week to put gas in the tank of my car, I would show up for the job. But if it's class, what happens if I don't show up for class? Most of them are pretty boring anyhow. I said, you're going to regret this. And so we set it up, of course, with his parents setting it up so that he was going to get paid on whatever allowance they were going to give him was contingent upon reports of having his work done. Not getting good grades and not getting something at the end of the year, but what's going on this week. Is he showing up for class? Is he getting the work done that matches what was required for on the syllabus? This was a matter of his saying straight out, I need immediate rewards or immediate penalties. And as a matter of fact, it helped once we switched over to doing it that way. This is Mike, 21-year-old university student. And he said, my dad always said I'm smart but just lazy. Maybe he's right. I just got put on academic probation. Now I've got to drop out. I'm always spacing out, can't get started on anything till the last minute. I tried my friend's ADHD med. It helped a lot, but my dad doesn't want me evaluated for ADHD. He said meds are like going on steroids when you're in sports. And here's a situation where it looked like the parents were convinced that he just was immature. The parents came in for a conversation with me about this, and the father was really pretty upfront. He said, Doctor, I've got to tell you, I'm not too much in favor of this ADD thing. I think it's just a matter of laziness and immaturity on his part. We don't have enough money to keep paying for semesters where there are no credits being earned. And we think he needs to get out there and get a job and then see what he can do and whether he's really going to be able to go to college or not at all. And that was the beginning point of the conversation. And we tracked through a number of different things in the course of his treatment. But what happened was I asked Mike about what was going on with the idea of the medicine. And he said, my father didn't say that I couldn't do it, but he just said he didn't think it was a good idea. And I said, what do you think? He says, well, I've got two different pictures in my head. On the one hand, I have this picture that maybe if I had that medicine, one day I'll be walking off the graduation platform with a diploma in my hand. I can see that, sort of. But he said, I've got another picture, and that is my father's got a brother, my uncle, who is a really smart guy, and everybody thought he was going to do really well in college, and he ended up dropping out after his first year, and now he works as a janitor at the school, at the high school, and everybody thought he was going to be the star of the family and a teacher. He couldn't finish college. He said, I could see that for me too. You see, what we're talking about here are possible selves. We all have pictures in our heads of what we'll look like if things are really going well and what we'll look like if the nightmare happens and we really don't do well at all. Mike had the picture of his uncle in his head. He had the picture of himself as a college graduate in his head. And he's going back and forth between the two. And it wasn't just that his father was hesitant about the medication, so was Mike. And so once again, we did an IQ test on him, and he scored way up there. And he was kind of surprised. But the fact is, even that wasn't enough because he was still caught up in his conflicts over this. We had to do a lot of talking about this. And we talked about a lot of other things that were problematic for him. Eventually, he decided to try the medicine in spite of the social anxiety, in spite of the skepticism of his family and these sort of possible selves that he had in mind. But it turned out there were some other concerns that he had not been able to bring up. He had some social anxiety of his own in terms of his hesitation about, he said, I can be good friends with a girl, but I can't have a girl as a girlfriend. And I said, what's that about? And he says, because I'm just afraid that if I ask somebody out, I wouldn't be able to get it together to be able to have a decent relationship with her, and especially if she was interested in getting together sexually. And I said, he said, I think I might be gay. And he sort of stumbled over it. I said, well, what makes you think that? And he went on with this hesitation. Well, it turns out, I said, I don't care whether you're gay or not. What's the story? And as we talked about it, it became clear that it wasn't that he was attracted to guys. It was that he thought of himself as a defective male because he was fearful about whether or not he's going to be able to function effectively, with females. And so we had to spend some time talking about that. And gradually, as we spent a little bit of time talking about this, he decided to take the medicine. He was doing well. He got back to school and changed his major. This went on over some time. But we got to a point where he was doing well enough that we both felt that it was time that he didn't need to keep seeing me on a regular basis anymore. We cut down the sessions. He said, before we do that, there's something I've just never quite figured out. Why is it that all of my friends, I was in high-track classes in high school, and all my friends were going right off to college, and I just didn't never apply. My parents kept telling me that they thought I was too immature to do it, and I guess I just bought into it. And I said, why? He said, my grades were good. I wasn't a superstar, but I was getting mostly A's and B's. I said, well, what was going on at that time? I said, well, I don't know. I guess that's back when my mom came home from the hospital. I said, what was going on with your mom? He said, well, she was in the psych hospital. She got pretty depressed. They were afraid she was going to kill herself. And she was in there for quite a while. And I said, well, how was she when she came home? He said she was pretty depressed then, too. They gave her some medicine. It didn't do very much for a while. I said, well, how'd your dad deal with it? He said, he's not much of a talker. He'd just come home and have a few beers and go to sleep. And I said, well, what'd you do? He said, well, I had to be sure she got something to eat because sometimes she wasn't fixing any food for herself. And I tried to talk with her because he wasn't talking with her very much. And at that point, it became a little clearer what was going on. You know, a lot of times parents worry about how the kids are going to do when they go off to school. My situation was the opposite. He was worried about what would happen with his parents when he left. You know, and the fact is, the family myth that was developed was that he was too immature to go away to college, when in fact his mother's situation was too fragile for her to be alone with a husband who was just drinking too much and not able to make any contact with her, when in fact she'd been suicidal. You know, now it's not like everybody has things this dramatic that are buried underneath this, but my point is simply that when people have ADHD, sometimes they've got mixed feelings not only about the disorder, but also about other things that are going on, and those emotions can have a big impact on whether or not they're going to be able to function on other things. Let me just mention one more student. This is James, 20-year-old college student. He came in, this is during the summer. He said, you know, if I don't finish 4 papers this month, I'm going to be put on probation at school. I just can't get myself to finish. I've had this problem a long time. Now it's worse than ever. I've done the research for most of my papers, but I can't get past the first paragraph in any one of them. I'm stuck. I asked him, can you write a rough draft of a paper and then go back and change it? He said, oh, no. He says, I have to get the first sentence to sound just right before I can write the second sentence. And then I've got to get the second sentence to sound just right before I can write the third. I said, damn, that's a slow way to write a paper. You know, but that was his perfectionism. And I said, well, what are you doing? So he brought his notes down, and I thought maybe he was just giving me a story about his research, but the fact is he had an enormous amount of information about these various topics that he was supposed to be writing these papers about. And I looked at the stuff, and the parents' response to it was they were just, everything's going to be all right, you're going to be able to do this, don't you worry about it. They were in total denial about the nature of the problem. And, you know, he was immobilized by his perfectionism, and the thing that he would get into doing is gaming. You know, he was spending an average of about 6 hours a day doing video games, and he was real good at it, and it helped him relax. But the problem is it did not help him get his papers done. He also was kind of a shy guy who was terrified about getting a driver's license. Most of the kids, you know, they can hardly wait to get a little piece of plastic, but in his case, it was quite different from that. And it was a matter of being in a spot where he just was not able to do it. You know, it took, my point here is simply that some of these things are layered and there are multiple things going on. And it's not just that you can't, you know, it turned out that this kid needed a year of work before he's able to go back to school. It was not going to happen in a month. So a lot of the discussion in the ADHD literature where they're finally beginning to deal with some issues about emotion is just about putting the brakes on excessive expression of anger or frustration. But what I'm finding is that a lot of the people I see with ADD, yeah, they have some trouble sometimes putting the lid on it and sometimes shoot their mouths off or act in ways that annoy other people without realizing it ahead of time. But there are a lot more people who have trouble with ignition, getting the car started, rather than just putting the brakes on. And so how can, I've already talked a little bit about some of these examples about the ways in which emotions can sort of flood the mind of people with ADHD. You get too much of one emotion. And the way in which that emerges sometimes, there's one, I think of one mother, for example, who spoke about the difficulty that she had in thinking about the experience of her sons and her dad, her father. The father had ADHD and the boys did too. And the father had a big thing about how he wanted the kids to take responsibility for taking the trash cans out on Monday night, and then they had a house with a long driveway, so they had to drag the things down and put them out at the end of the driveway. And then on Tuesday, when they came back from school, they're supposed to drag the trash cans back and put them in the garage. And these kids were not getting it done. They're 14 years old and 16 years old. And this job was not getting done. And the father would come home at the end of the day pretty tired and frustrated from work because he was going through a difficult spell in work anyhow. And she said, but it's terrible what happens. He comes in smoking. There's smoke coming out of his ears. He's just enraged with these kids when he sees those garbage cans out there, and he'll call them into the kitchen where he's just walked in and hasn't even taken his coat off yet, and said, "You did it again." How many times do I have to tell you? You guys have to learn some responsibility, because you're going to be losers. You are not going to be able to make it through school. You are never going to be able to get a job where you're going to be able to support yourselves. Don't think we're going to be able to supply you with a lot of money as you're getting older. You have to learn how to take responsibility for yourself, because if you don't, you are going to be total losers. You can't take care of one thing. Think about all the stuff we do for you, and you can't bring these damn garbage cans back up the driveway after I've asked you again and again and again to take care of it. It's like you just don't care. You're flipping me the bird. You just do not care about what I'm asking from you. And my concern is that if you keep going on this way, you are definitely not going to be able to make it through college. You are definitely not going to be able to get a decent job, and you're going to get some unskilled job, go flip burgers at Burger King until you're 50. And the mother said, the kids have gotten so they can sort of just keep still and let him say his thing. They know better than to argue with him. But she said, what worries me is I see that look on their face. And part of it is they're annoyed with him because he gets carried away. But the other part of it is that part of them believes what he's saying and are wondering if maybe he might be right. And she said he always apologizes later in the evening or maybe by the next morning, but I don't know that that really erases the impact of that if it happens again and again and again. And this is an example of how sometimes people with ADHD just get flooded with one emotion. And it's as though other emotions, which are also important, this guy loved his kids. He didn't want to hurt them. He didn't want them to be demoralized and think that they were unable to do anything. But the fact is, he was so caught up in that emotion himself that at that moment he just sort of lost track of everything else that was also important to him. Some people have too little emotion. They talk about how they can't get started on things they need to do. And they'll get stuck in the concerns of whatever it is they're doing at that particular moment and forget about what the longer-term implications might be. I'm thinking, for example, of one woman who was telling me about how one night she had come home with a project she had to do for work. She worked on it late, and then she had a big argument with her husband. And so she was up until about 2:33 in the morning. And she was dead tired. And the alarm went off, and she hit the snooze button, and then she hit it again and again, and she ended up going into work an hour and a half late. And it was not until she got in the door and saw her supervisor's face that she suddenly remembered that she'd had a meeting with the supervisor just a week earlier saying the big boss is tired of seeing you come into office late, and you had better get this pulled together because otherwise the boss is talking about firing you. At the moment that alarm went off, all she could think of was, I'm tired, I need more sleep, I didn't get enough sleep last night. And it's not like she had in her head at the same time the other memory, which if she'd had it would have been enough to get her out of bed. Or people do this impulsive purchase. They'll see something that they want to get and it looks nice and they'll buy it without thinking about the fact that charge cards do eventually send bills and that they may not be able to afford what it is they're trying to do. This is that Walter Mischel marshmallow test that I was talking about before. He talks about the hot motivation of the what you want now, particularly when you've got it in front of you, and then the cool capacity to sort of look at it and think about it later and hold on. And he said, well, what you should do in that situation is that you should cool the now, find ways of being able to rethink what the situation is that you think you have to do now, and then heat up the later consequence to think a little more about what the consequences will be if you do it or if you don't. Well, sometimes that works, but often people need somebody else with them to be able to help them think that sort of thing through, those if-then propositions. But unfortunately, many people with ADHD think about this, they'll brag about their hyperfocus, that I can zero in and I can stay focused on something. But for many people, it operates as though you're watching a basketball game through a telescope. Think about what you do. If you have a telescope and you are watching a basketball game, you can see very clearly what's going on right in that little circle, but you are not going to see where the other players are positioned. You're not going to see who can pass. You're not going to see where the defenders are. You're not going to be able to watch the action and get the whole picture. And many people with ADD complain that they have a lot of trouble catching the other relevant aspects of the situation to make the kind of decisions that are going to help them out. ADHD working memory impairments can just bias motivation and impair it. You know, and one of the main things in ADHD is difficulty with working memory, and the difficulty that many people have is keeping in mind the multiple emotions or the multiple goals they have at a particular time in order to keep that big picture in their head. What can you do about it? Well, there are a few things. One is, it helps if you're not drinking too much, or you're not getting high too much, or you're not spending a lot of time on video games. Now, there's some people where that's how they chill out, but the fact is it's got a price tag. And I'm talking about excessive. I'm not saying that anybody is going to have to be totally abstaining from anything they like. It's important to try to anticipate the times you're going to be vulnerable. You know, like, if you have trouble getting up, you need to arrange with somebody to help back you up on that. If you're taking medication for ADHD, it might be a good idea to talk with your prescriber about whether or not you're getting adequate coverage. For example, the long-acting formulations of medication that they say are all day only last for the school day for most people. And the vast majority of people I see who are taking these longer-acting formulations also need a booster dose late afternoon, early evening to be able to help them get their homework done or whatever it is they've got to do in the evening. You know, and you try to figure out this less stressful situations where you can operate, but also this sort of cool now, heat later, not as easily done as said, but it can be help. And the main thing is a lot of people just need some help. It might be a partner, a husband or a wife or a parent. It might be a friend. It might be a coach, but somebody who can help to deal with this. The medications we have work very well for some people, somewhat for others, a little bit for others, and not at all for others. But the fact is, the pills do not teach the skills. You know, and you need other people to be able to help with these things to be able to get it to work. And that's one of the strengths that you have in the program at this university. And of course, the other thing that's important is to be able to recognize that nobody's going to hit it 100% of the time anyhow. But these are all issues that need support in addition to medication. So let me just wrap what I'm trying to say here at this point, and that is, as I said earlier, and I will say it again, that the essential problem in ADHD is this developmental impairment of executive functions, which sometimes fixes itself as a person gets a little bit older, but it may take longer. And that there are brain differences that underlie ADHD, and they include the difficulties in the delay in maturation of some of these areas and disrupted communications and so forth. But that those with ADHD often have chronic difficulties with motivation in many, but not in all situations. And it's a question of how can you build on the strengths and not just get hung up on the weaknesses. I've tried to suggest to you that the chemistry of motivation is modulated by a very complex set of processes that focus around the amygdala, but that's not the only hub. But it's sort of individualized, emotion-laden memories. They're just embedded in what we see and what we think faster than anything that we're going to be able to consciously think about. And that working memory and focusing impairments characteristic of ADHD may impair motivation by causing emotional flooding, where you just get flooded with one emotion that blocks everything else, or a constricted focus where you're like watching the basketball game with a telescope and not looking at the bigger picture of where you're headed with that. So at this point, what I would propose is that I think you've got some questions for me to respond to.